Napoleon, in a Nutshell, by Neil Wenborn. Read by Rupert Degas. In our time, Napoleon once remarked to an aide, no one has the slightest conception of what is great. It is up to me to give them an example. It was 1796, and Bonaparte, as everyone then knew him, was 26 years old, an untried general tasting success on his first campaign. He was as good as his word. Within weeks, he was the talk of Europe. Within months, he would so dominate the political landscape of the continent that for the best part of the next 2 decades, its story is scarcely separable from his own. Like the classical heroes who inspired him, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal, Napoleon seems to belong as much to the realm of myth as to the pages of history. Brooding in exile on the island of St. Helena in his final years, he compared his life to a novel. But to many, it reads more like Greek tragedy, an epic of hubris leading inexorably to nemesis. So deeply has it entered the collective consciousness that it has become a kind of archetype. We don't need footnotes to understand the message of Aber's Waterloo, or to know what Arthur Conan Doyle means when he describes Sherlock Holmes's arch-enemy Moriarty as the Napoleon of crime. Look up Napoleon in the dictionary, and you find he has even become a common noun. The definition? A person regarded as having gained supremacy through ruthless ambition. If, as has been claimed, Napoleon is the single most written about individual after Jesus Christ, it is partly because his career and personality were so boundlessly multifaceted. Books, hundreds of them, have been devoted to his military campaigns, his politics, his cultural influence, his sex life. He's been claimed as the progenitor of modern nationalism, the template for the totalitarian leaderships of the 20th century, even as the godfather of the European Union. But Napoleon still eludes the grasp of historians as he eluded the grasp of those who were closest to him. As his secretary wrote, each of us, without ceasing to be honest, can show a different Napoleon. Those different Napoleons continue to polarize opinion today as sharply as they divided his contemporaries. So, who was he, this phenomenon who gave his name to an age? The man who was to become Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, was born on the 15th of August 1769 in the port town of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica. The second son of a family which traced its roots to the Italian nobility, he was baptized Napoleone di Buonaparte, adopting the less Italian-sounding Bonaparte only when he was 26. Like his 7 surviving siblings, among them the future rulers of several vassal states of the French Empire, he spoke a dialect of Italian as his first language, and his Corsican accent was mocked by enemies throughout his life. Corsica, in the 1760s, was contested territory. It had been owned by Genoa since the 15th century, but had been run for years by a rebel government under Pasquale Paoli, a close associate of Napoleon's father Carlo. The year before Napoleon was born, the Genoese finally cut their losses and sold the island to France. French troops promptly garrisoned it and drove Paoli into exile, but Carlo stayed and threw in his lot with the occupiers. As a result, Napoleon grew up torn between 2 cultures. Corsican by birth and ancestry, he was a French subject by accident of history. His education compounded the dilemma. At the age of 9, he was sent to the French mainland, where he attended a military college at Brienne and the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, the French equivalent of Sandhurst or West Point. A provincial scarecrow among the polished sons of the Ancien Régime aristocracy, he was remembered by fellow students as a prickly loner obsessed with Corsican independence. In 1785, he became the first Corsican ever to graduate from the École and was commissioned second lieutenant to a smart artillery regiment. He was 16 years old and had not seen his homeland for 7 years. Napoleon was stationed with his regiment in Auxerre when, in the summer of 1789, Paris experienced the first throes of the revolution that would eventually clear his path to power in France. For the moment, though, his sights were still fixed on Corsica. Here he saw the revolution as a chance to throw off the hated yoke of the Bourbon monarchy and to make a name for himself in the process. Stretching his army leave to the limits, he spent most of the next 4 years on the island, navigating with mixed success the turbulence of a clan-based society exposed to the vicissitudes of a national revolution. A cheerleader for Paoli's return in 1790, by 1793 he found himself aligned with the forces of revolution against his former hero. In June that year, Paoli's patience with the Bonapartes finally snapped, and he outlawed the entire family, who fled for the south of France. Napoleon's political apprenticeship in Corsica has been seen as a journey from youthful idealism to disillusionment. It certainly resolved his conflict of patriotic loyalties. "I am not Corsican," he would say on St. Helena. "I was brought up in France, therefore I am French." The political contours of the France in which Napoleon now found himself had changed almost beyond recognition in the last 4 years. The monarchy had fallen in August 1792. Napoleon happened to be in Paris at the time, and the horrors he witnessed when thousands of armed citizens stormed the Tuileries Palace left him with an enduring contempt for the unruliness of the mob. The National Convention had declared France a republic the following month, and King Louis XVI had been guillotined in January 1793. Most significant of all for the young captain of artillery, as he now was, France was at war with a coalition of powers, the so-called First Coalition, which included Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and Holland. The combined pressures of war and revolution had opened deep divisions in French society, and by the time the Bonapartes washed up near Toulon in the summer of 1793, the country was sliding into civil war. In particular, their arrival coincided with the so-called Federalist Revolt, a major provincial protest against the direction the revolution was taking, which saw several key towns, including Marseille and Toulon, rise up against their revolutionary authorities. It was the revolt in Toulon which gave Napoleon his first big break. Britain's Royal Navy was blockading the port, and in August 1793, the Federalist rebels opted to surrender the city to the British rather than to their own government forces. A Republican army was sent to reclaim it, but in the first hours of the siege, the French artillery commander was seriously wounded. Napoleon happened to be in the right place at the right time, and crucially with the right contacts, to be appointed to the vacant post. He swung into action with all the energy, attention to detail, and monumental self-confidence that were to characterize his later career. Going far beyond his brief, he identified the key point in the British defences, a fortress overlooking the harbour, lobbied the convention to accept his plan for taking it, drafted in the necessary artillery, and led a successful assault on the position. In the process, he took a bayonet thrust in the thigh, the only serious wound he would ever receive. Once the fortress was captured, his artillery were able to command the harbour. The British fleet was forced to withdraw, and by the end of the year, Toulon was once again in the hands of the revolutionary government. Promoted brigadier general for his part in the operation, he also found himself favoured by the Robespierrists, soon to be the most powerful force on the national stage. In the short term, however, Napoleon's visibility after Toulon proved as much a threat as an opportunity. Support in high places enabled him to develop plans for a forward campaign in Italy, a pet scheme that was soon to become his specialism. But it also left him vulnerable to changes at the top in Paris. On the fall of Robespierre in July 1794, Napoleon was arrested and might easily have gone to the guillotine like many others linked to the Robespierre regime. He extricated himself, but the next 15 months were among the most directionless of his life. He made little headway with the new government, and his career seemed to have stalled when in October 1795 his fortunes took a new and decisive turn. That month saw another of the great Parisian uprisings that had punctuated the revolution since its inception. Outraged by the convention's constitutional gerrymandering, some 25,000 insurgents, many with royalist sympathies, gathered to march on the Tuileries, the former royal palace where the convention sat. The deputies entrusted the defence of the palace to Paul Barras, a slippery soldier-turned-politician who had played a key role in the fall of Robespierre. Barras had been present at the siege of Toulon, where he had been impressed by Napoleon. Now he asked the 26-year-old to act as his second-in-command, in charge of artillery. Cannon were quickly requisitioned and set up commanding the approaches to the palace. On the afternoon of the 5th of October, 13 Vendémiaire in the revolutionary calendar, the insurgents converged on the Tuileries and were driven back by grape-shot fired into their ranks. Tens, perhaps hundreds, died. It was the first time the army had been used against civilians in Paris since before the revolution. What the siege of Toulon had been to Napoleon's reputation in the south of France, the Vendémiaire rising was to his standing in the vastly more important arena of Paris. As at Toulon, his role in the proceedings was only a subsidiary one. It took more than his famous whiff of grape-shot finally to disperse the insurgents. But so skillful was his public relations management in the aftermath of the crisis that he was soon being feted as Général Vendémiaire, the man who saved the revolution. He was promoted to Major General, and when Barras joined the five-man directory that would govern France for the next 4 years, Napoleon took over his command of the Army of the Interior, effectively the home enforcement arm of the revolution. At a stroke, he had become a force to be reckoned with in the increasingly militarized politics of the Republic. This spectacular turnaround in Napoleon's professional prospects was matched by a transformation in his personal life. It was around the time of Vendémiaire that he met the woman whose name would forever be linked to his in the popular imagination. The Vicomtesse Marie-Rose de Beauharnais, Napoleon would rechristen her Josephine, was the widow of an aristocrat guillotined in the final days of Robespierre's terror. A woman of sophisticated sexual allure, 6 years older than Napoleon, she had 2 children and had been the mistress of several influential men, including Barras. Napoleon fell passionately in love, and the couple were married in Paris on the 9th of March 1796. While he was courting Josephine, Napoleon was also lobbying for a battlefield command, a posting with more scope for glory than the Army of the Interior. For years he had been bombarding decision-makers with plans for a more aggressive campaign in Italy. At the end of February 1796, his persistence paid off. With the support of Barras, he got himself appointed head of the Army of Italy, the part of the French army deployed on the Italian front. Just 2 days after his wedding, Napoleon left Josephine behind him to take up his new command at Nice. In March 1796, the only powers still at war with France were Britain, Austria, and Piedmont, the foremost military state of northern Italy. Napoleon's plan was to prevent the armies of Austria and Piedmont joining up in Italy, to defeat each separately, and to advance on Vienna in conjunction with the Army of the Rhine. It was the tallest of orders. For one thing, the Army of Italy was an ill-disciplined force of fewer than 38,000 fighting men who had not been paid for months and were lacking equipment, uniforms, and even shoes. For another, the generals under Napoleon's command were openly contemptuous of his youth and inexperience. Neither state of affairs would survive the galvanizing impact of Napoleon's authority. What followed was one of the most breathtaking campaigns in military history. In the first 12 days, Napoleon achieved what previous French generals had failed to do in 4 years. In a flurry of engagements beginning at Montenotte on the 12th of April, he drove a wedge between the armies of Austria and Piedmont and forced the Piedmontese back on Turin. By the 23rd, they had sued for peace. No sooner was an armistice signed with Piedmont than Napoleon turned his attention to Austria. In a lightning march, he outflanked the Austrian army, crossing the River Po at Piacenza and occupying Milan. By the end of May, he had swept right across Lombardy, driving the Austrians out of all their Italian strongholds except Mantua. It was perhaps the fastest campaign before motorization. "My troops," Napoleon declared, "have moved as rapidly as my thoughts." A key moment in this phase of the campaign was the Battle of Lodi, near Milan. Here, French troops fought their way across a bridge over the river Adda under heavy fire from a rear guard of the Austrian army. The engagement was of questionable strategic value, but in propaganda terms, it did more for Napoleon's image as conquering hero than any event of his career to date. Still more important for the future was its effect on his self-image. It was after Lodi, he later said, that he began to see himself as a superior being, destined perhaps for a grander role than that of France's most successful soldier. "From that moment," he told his associates on St. Helena, "I glimpsed the goal, and I marched towards it." Throughout the second half of 1796, Austria made repeated attempts to relieve the siege of Mantua. Napoleon repulsed them in a series of engagements at Castiglione, Bassano, and Arcola, the latter a bridge storming to rival Lodi in Napoleonic folklore. In January 1797, a final Austrian counter-offensive was decisively defeated at the three-day Battle of Rivoli, the greatest of Napoleon's early victories, which resulted in the loss of nearly half the Austrian army. With the fall of Mantua the following month, Napoleon pressed on towards Vienna. The French were only 75 miles from the city when the Austrians sued for peace in April. Equally transformative was the political campaign that unfolded in tandem with the military one. As Napoleon advanced, acting ever more independently of Paris, he oversaw the establishment of brand new political entities in the territories he occupied. These so-called sister republics were effectively French client regimes, knitted together from the complex patchwork of Italian states. But they were also, conspicuously, Napoleon's personal creations, a fact reflected in the regal splendor of the court he established around himself and Josephine at the Palace of Mombello near Milan. The balance of power had shifted between the Directory in Paris and Napoleon in the field. Not only was Napoleon single-handedly rewriting the power relations of Europe, the cash-strapped Directory was increasingly dependent on the staggering flow of bullion, cash and art treasures he was sending home from the conquered territories. Napoleon himself was well aware of his new strength. "I have tasted supremacy," he said, "and I can no longer renounce it." In October 1797, he concluded the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria, disposing territories as he saw fit. Under its terms, Austria received parts of the centuries-old Venetian Republic in exchange for recognizing the sister republics and France's claims to both Belgium and a so-called natural frontier along the left bank of the Rhine. In December 1797, Napoleon returned to Paris to find his name on everyone's lips. But how to keep it there? "In Paris, nothing is remembered for long," he remarked. "If I remain doing nothing, I am lost." The Directory asked him to plan for an invasion of England, the only power still formally at war with France. But Napoleon soon rejected the idea as impractical. Instead, he turned his attention to the east, mounting an ambitious expedition to Egypt, ostensibly to establish a French presence in the Middle East and challenge Britain's colonial possessions in India. The fleet that left Toulon for Egypt on the 19th of May, 1798, was one of the largest ever assembled. It included not only 35,000 troops, but a substantial contingent of artists, archaeologists, and scientists, an intellectual cadre which has been credited with the foundation of Egyptology. Among its many achievements was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Eluding Nelson's patrols in the Mediterranean, Napoleon first seized the island of Malta, almost without a fight, reorganizing its government in a matter of days before sailing on to Alexandria, which he took on the 2nd of July. After a hellish 2-week march across the Egyptian desert, his army routed the cavalry of the ruling Mamelukes at the Battle of the Pyramids on the 21st of July. 3 days later, he captured Cairo. Presenting himself as the friend of Islam and the liberator of the Egyptian people from Mameluke oppression, he proceeded to set up a new administration for the country, with himself at its head. It was in Cairo, too, that Napoleon learnt what had long been an open secret to everyone else. In his absence, Josephine was having an affair. The experience traumatized him, perhaps permanently. "I am sick of human nature," he wrote to his older brother, Joseph. "There is nothing left for me but complete egotism." But worse was to follow. On the 1st of August, Nelson descended on the French fleet in Aboukir Bay and all but destroyed it in an audacious attack known as the Battle of the Nile. The victory, the most crushing of the Age of Sail, stiffened Egyptian resistance to French occupation and led Turkey, Egypt's nominal overlord, to declare war on France. It also left Napoleon and his army stranded in Egypt, cut off from reinforcements and European news, and suffering from the ravages of the climate and a mounting epidemic of plague. Napoleon's response, characteristically, was to raise the stakes. In February 1799, he invaded Syria with an army of just 13,000 men, apparently aiming to secure Egypt against Anglo-Turkish attack. After another infernal desert march, he succeeded in capturing Jaffa, where notoriously he authorized the execution of some 3,000 prisoners of war, an act widely regarded as a crime even by the uncodified conventions of 18th-century warfare. Within 2 weeks he was besieging the old Crusader citadel of St. John of Acre, now reinforced by a British garrison. It was a city too far. For 2 months, Napoleon launched wave upon wave of assaults against its walls, but Acre held firm. Finally, on the 20th of May, with an Anglo-Turkish fleet in the offing, Napoleon abandoned the siege and began the long retreat towards Egypt. By the time the expeditionary force had trailed back across the desert to Cairo, he had lost more than a third of his men, a disaster even Napoleon struggled to spin to his advantage. Not so what followed. Just 1 month later, a Turkish invasion force landed in Aboukir Bay. Napoleon marched his men straight to the attack, driving the invaders back into the sea. He immediately dispatched a bulletin to Paris presenting the battle as the crowning triumph of the whole campaign. In the days after the Battle of Aboukir, Napoleon finally received news from Europe. It was grim. Since he left France the previous year, the Peace of Campo Formio had comprehensively unravelled, and the nation was once again at war. Worse, in recent months she had lost almost all Napoleon's territorial gains in Italy. Ever since the Italian campaign, senior figures in Paris had been urging Napoleon to make a decisive intervention in French politics. Thus far, he had judged them premature. Now he was ready. He left his beleaguered army to fend for itself in Egypt, and on the 22nd of August, under cover of darkness and in conditions of the greatest secrecy, he took ship for France. His timing was perfect. News of the victory at Aboukir had arrived a few days ahead of him, and when he landed at Fréjus on the 9th of October, there were outbreaks of popular enthusiasm throughout the country. Napoleon made his way to Paris, where, after a tempestuous reconciliation with Josephine, he spent the next few days catching up on what had happened in his absence and testing the political temperature. What he found was a nation desperately weary of political disruption. After Vendémiaire, the Directory had vowed to replace, with a new social order, the chaos which always accompanies revolutions. But the last 4 years had been a period of seesaw politics, during which, against a backdrop of massive economic dislocation, the directors charted a choppy course between the resurgent extremes of Jacobinism and royalism. Now, after a decade of revolutionary change, there was a widespread longing for stability. Napoleon also found Paris a hotbed of political intrigue. For weeks there had been plots of different political complexions against the regime, both inside and outside government. After days of discussions with key political actors, including his brother Lucien, now president of the Legislative Council of 500, Napoleon decided where his best opportunity lay. The Abbé Sieyès, a moderate director and one of the founding fathers of the revolution, was planning a constitutional coup and looking for a so-called sword to lend support to it. From the moment Napoleon made landfall in France, he was the most conspicuous candidate. An understanding was reached around the beginning of November 1799. The result, a few days later, was the coup of Brumaire. Sieyès' plan was for the two legislative councils to overturn the Constitution of 1795 in favour of a new provisional executive, to include himself and Napoleon. On the 9th of November, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, the councils were induced to relocate themselves from Paris to the former royal palace at Saint-Cloud amid fabricated rumours of a Jacobin rising. Here they were surrounded by troops under Napoleon's command, supposedly for the deputies' own protection. So far, so good. But the next day, everything started to go wrong. Within hours, it began to look as if the plotters had overestimated their support in the councils, whose sessions proved unexpectedly stormy. With momentum slipping away by the hour, Napoleon decided to act. After interrupting the Council of Elders with a bizarre harangue, he strode into the Council of 500. Here he was set upon by a mob of deputies crying, "Outlaw!" and had to be rescued by his military guard, who dragged him out into the courtyard. Only the cool head of his brother Lucien saved the day. Coming outside, Lucien persuaded the waiting troops that the legislature itself was under threat from a group of dagger-wielding deputies inside the building. Only then did Napoleon rally, sending in a detachment of soldiers with bayonets to clear the chamber. The deputies fled, some jumping out of windows in their rush to escape. In the early hours of the morning, the three-man provisional executive was sworn in. The age of the Directory was over. For all its shambolic drama, however, Brumaire was just a curtain-raiser. Only in the days that followed did the true scope of Napoleon's ambition become evident to his co-conspirators. During the next month, he dominated the drafting of a new constitution, outmanoeuvring Sieyès on every key issue. The resulting political framework was a clear reflection of his will. Two new legislative bodies would be set up, the tribunate and the legislature, but both would be little more than talking shops. Real power would belong to the executive, a three-man consulate in which the powers of the first consul vastly outstripped those of the other two. The new constitution was presented to the French people on the 15th of December 1799 with the ringing proclamation, "Citizens, the revolution is established on the principles with which it began. It is over." The name of the first consul was a foregone conclusion. As first consul, Napoleon would apply to the rebuilding of France the same vast reserves of energy and determination he had applied to his campaigns in Italy and Egypt. Over the coming years, he would set in place a series of fundamental reforms, great granite blocks, as he called them, which have been seen as the foundation stones of modern France. But first of all, he knew he must deliver the peace with honour that the nation expected of him. He had come to power on the strength of his military prowess. What he needed above all else was a decisive victory in the conflict that had consumed so much of the country's human and financial capital over the past 8 years. On the 14th of June, 1800, at Marengo in Lombardy, he won it. The Battle of Marengo was the outcome of a daring strategy to defeat the resurgent Austrian armies in Italy by attacking them in the rear from across the Alps. This meant crossing the mountains with an army of 35,000 men at a time when there was still snow on the passes. The crossing, soon to be compared with Hannibal's, produced perhaps the most iconic of all images of Napoleon. David's famous portrait shows him pointing the way to victory atop a rearing charger, the alpine winds snatching at his cape. The truth was more prosaic. He actually made the crossing on the back of a recalcitrant mule. Marengo, too, was more glorious in the telling than the reality. The Alpine crossing did indeed catch the Austrians unawares, and within weeks Napoleon had recovered most of the ground lost since his previous Italian campaign. But at this point he badly misread the Austrians' strength and intentions, and when they counter-attacked at Marengo, he in turn was caught by surprise. His greatly outnumbered men had already fallen back 5 miles and were well on the way to defeat when General Doucet arrived with last-minute reinforcements. Doucet's intervention turned the tide of the battle, albeit at the cost of his own life. The glory fell to Napoleon. Marengo was not a knockout blow. That would be left to General Moreau, who trounced the Austrians at Hohenlinden in December. The Treaty of Lunéville, a virtual retread of Campo Formio, was signed with Austria in February 1801. It would be March 1802 before a separate Anglo-French treaty was signed at Amiens, bringing to an end the conflict known to history as the French Revolutionary Wars. But with Marengo, Napoleon's personal power was sealed in victory. After it, he was free to concentrate his formidable resources on the great granite blocks of domestic reconstruction. That reconstruction reached into every area of French life, from education to the exchequer, from the press to the pulpit. A system of departmental prefects was set up to exercise the power of central government in the regions. Nominated by the first consul himself, the prefects were a supercharged version of the intendant of the Ancien Régime, and soon exerted a grip on the provinces that Louis XVI could only have dreamt of. Napoleon also moved quickly to restore the nation's tottering finances. A central bank, the Bank of France, was established in the first weeks of the new regime, and the collection of taxes was streamlined to an extent not seen since before the Revolution. Law and order was re-established by a mixture of force and conciliation. Many of the Directory's political prisoners were released, and tens of thousands of émigrés who had fled France during the Revolution were allowed to return. At the same time, the first consul lent his authority to a rationalization of the thousands of decrees issued by successive revolutionary regimes. Previous attempts to codify this welter of legislation had bogged down in the shifting political sands of the last 10 years. Now it was forged into a comprehensive system of law known as the Civil Code. Promulgated in 1804, it was renamed the Code Napoleon in 1807, and remains to this day the basis of jurisprudence in France and several of her former territories. Among the more controversial of the granite blocks was the Legion of Honor, an elaborate hierarchical system of rewards and titles open to both civilians and the military. Designed to equate nobility not with birth and feudal privilege but with service to the state, the Legion further strengthened the first consul's grip on the machinery of patronage. Opponents derided it as a system of baubles which betrayed the Revolution's commitment to equality, but by 1814 the Legion boasted some 32,000 members, and it continues to thrive in 21st century France. Perhaps most significant of all was Napoleon's initiative to resolve the country's long-festering religious divisions. The Revolution had nationalized church lands and launched a root-and-branch reorganization of the Catholic Church in France. The clergy were made subject to local election and priests required to take an oath of allegiance to the civil constitution on pain of losing their jobs. Confronting deep religious affiliations, these measures had split France and provided a rallying point for the forces of counter-revolution, especially after the Pope officially condemned them in 1791. Since 1795, church and state had been separated, and there had been an upsurge in Catholic observance throughout the country. But the rift between France and the papacy remained as wide as ever. Now, with Marengo behind him, Napoleon opened discussions with the new Pope, Pius VII. The result, after many months of negotiation, was the Concordat of July 1801, which passed into French law in April 1802. Under its terms, Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the great majority of the French people. All existing bishops were required to resign and were replaced by a new, smaller episcopate, nominated by the first consul and invested with their spiritual authority by the Pope. At the stroke of a pen, the Concordat overturned the anti-Catholic consensus of the revolutionary years, reintroduced freedom of worship in France, and, most significantly for the agnostic first consul, deprived royalism of its strongest recruiting sergeant. Some historians have seen the passage of the Concordat as the high watermark of Napoleon's rule. The treaties of Lunéville and Amiens had brought the war of the Second Coalition to an end on terms highly favourable to French territorial interests. For the first time in 10 years, France was at peace with her European neighbours and experiencing the fruits of that peace at home under a regime that seemed at last to have consigned to history the chronic instability of the revolutionary years. Napoleon's domestic stock had never been higher. Even opponents were grudgingly dazzled by what the future British Foreign Secretary George Canning called the ascendancy of his genius. As ever, Napoleon was quick to seize the moment. The nation was steered towards the form of gratitude expected of it in a plebiscite on the question, should the consulate be granted for life? The electorate followed their cue by a suspiciously large margin of 3.5 million votes to 8,000. And in August 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte was duly proclaimed life consul, with the right to appoint his own successor. Meanwhile, however, the Peace of Amiens was already breaking down under the pressures of mutual distrust. In the 14 months during which hostilities were suspended, Napoleon outdid himself in territorial adventurism. Among other interventions, he annexed Piedmont and Elba, created an Italian republic with himself as president, and sent a mission to assess all too publicly the prospects for retaking Egypt, now under British occupation. In return, Britain broke the treaty by refusing to evacuate Malta, which they had captured in 1800. By spring 1803, the patience of both signatories was at breaking point, and on the 18th of May, Britain declared war on France. The Napoleonic Wars had begun. They would end only with the fall of Napoleon himself, more than a decade later. At the outset, it was a distinctly asymmetrical conflict. Britain was supreme at sea, but had few land forces to commit to the continent. France, on the other hand, boasted the most formidable armies in Europe, but since the Battle of the Nile, had no navy worth the name. The result was a period of phony war. Napoleon built up his naval resources and gathered a huge flotilla at Boulogne with a view to invading England. He also seized strategic areas of the European coast and closed all French-controlled ports to British shipping. For its part, Britain set about the grindingly slow task of building a third coalition against France, while the Royal Navy patrolled the seas, blockading French and Allied coasts. Britain also sponsored clandestine operations aimed at regime change in France. Notorious among them was the Cadoudal plot of 1804, a royalist conspiracy led by one Georges Cadoudal to kidnap or murder Napoleon and replace him with a Bourbon prince on the throne of France. The plot was known to Napoleon's secret police, and the conspirators, including Cadoudal himself, were arrested in February. The identity of the Bourbon prince remained a mystery, but in March Napoleon ordered the seizure of his favoured suspect, the Duc d'Enghien, an émigré minor royal living just across the border in neutral Baden. A snatch squad brought Enghien to the fortress of Vincennes near Paris, where it soon became obvious that he had no connection whatever with the plot. Napoleon, however, wanted an example made, and on the 21st of March, in the early hours of the morning, Enghien was tried by a kangaroo tribunal, summarily shot and buried in the moat at Vincennes. Enghien's judicial murder shocked public opinion throughout Europe. In France, however, it precipitated a move Napoleon had clearly been contemplating for some time. The Cadoudal plot dramatized the risk to Napoleon's life from royalist conspiracy. But what if the life consul did die? What would a succession struggle mean for France's hard-won stability? In April, a compliant tribunate debated the principle of hereditary succession. The following month, Bonaparte was proclaimed Napoleon I, hereditary emperor of the French. His heir, if he had no son or adopted son, would be his brother Joseph. Another near-unanimous plebiscite confirmed the change, and on the 2nd of December 1804, Napoleon was crowned in a grandiose ceremony at Notre-Dame. In the teeth of immense controversy, the Pope was persuaded to travel from Rome to confer his benediction. But the climax of the occasion, immortalized in David's gargantuan painting, came when Napoleon, standing before the altar, placed the imperial crown on his own head. The following year, the phony war began to escalate into a real one. In May 1805, Napoleon provided dramatic new evidence of his international ambitions by having himself crowned hereditary King of Italy in blatant breach of the Treaty of Lunéville. Leaving his new kingdom, formerly the Italian Republic, in the vice-regal hands of his stepson Eugène de Beauharnais, he then annexed the Ligurian Republic, Parma and Piacenza, and made his sister Elise Duchess of Lucca and Princess of Piombino. These provocations catalyzed the emergence of the Third Coalition. By mid-August, Austria, Russia and Sweden had joined Britain in an alliance with a theoretical fighting strength of some 500,000 men. The same month, Napoleon gave orders for his English invasion army, now renamed the Grand Army, to leave Boulogne for Germany. Why hadn't he invaded England? In order to cross the Channel, the invasion flotilla needed naval support, and since 1803, the French Navy had been blockaded into its ports. Earlier in the year, therefore, Napoleon had ordered a sweeping diversionary operation. The plan was this: Admiral Villeneuve would break out of Toulon and head for the West Indies, joining up with other squadrons en route, including those of France's reluctant ally Spain. When the British fleet pursued him, Villeneuve would make a dash for the Channel and cover the invasion force before the Royal Navy could get back to intervene. Villeneuve had managed to break out of Toulon in March 1805, but thereafter everything went wrong, and in August he was still in Cadiz. When he eventually nosed out of harbour there on the 21st of October, he found Nelson waiting off Cape Trafalgar with 27 ships of the line. In a brilliant action, Nelson's fleet approached in 2 parallel columns, breaking the Franco-Spanish line. Most of Villeneuve's 33 men of war were destroyed or put out of action, and some 6,500 men were killed or wounded. Allied casualties were a quarter of that number, among them Nelson himself, whose death in the hour of victory assured him a lasting place in the pantheon of British heroes. So it was that in the late summer of 1805, the theatre of war shifted decisively to Germany. The coalition forces began to move on the 11th of September, when General Mack crossed into Bavaria with an Austrian army of some 75,000 men. But by the end of the month, the Grand Army, now almost 200,000 strong, had already swept across France and over the Rhine. It encircled the Austrians at Ulm, and on the 20th of October, Mack surrendered. His campaign had lasted just 3 weeks. By mid-November, Napoleon was installed at the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. But with Prussia hesitating whether to add its forces to the coalition, he had to act quickly. Within a couple of weeks, he forced a confrontation with a larger Austro-Russian army under General Kutuzov near the town of Austerlitz in Bohemia. Instead of swiftly attacking as he usually did, Napoleon made a feint of falling back, luring Kutuzov to attack his exposed right flank. He then struck at Kutuzov's undefended centre, splitting the Allied force in 2 and routing each. Often regarded as Napoleon's most spectacular military triumph, the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, destroyed the Third Coalition after less than 3 months of fighting. It was the 2nd of December, the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation as emperor. The next day, the Austrian Emperor Francis II sued for peace, and the Treaty of Pressburg was signed 3 weeks later. Austria lost all but one of her remaining toeholds in Italy and Germany, and Tsar Alexander I marched his troops back to Russia. "Roll up the map of Europe," the British Prime Minister William Pitt is said to have remarked when he heard the news of Austerlitz. "It will not be wanted these 10 years. For Napoleon, Austerlitz triggered another surge of geopolitical hyperactivity. In the early months of 1806, he extended the system of satellite monarchies begun with the Kingdom of Italy, placing other members of his family on the thrones of French vassal states. His brothers Joseph and Louis were proclaimed King of Naples and King of Holland, respectively, while his brother-in-law Joachim Murat was given the Grand Duchy of Berg. In July, Napoleon sounded the death knell of the millennium-old Holy Roman Empire by creating the Confederation of the Rhine, an amalgam of 16 German principalities with himself as its protector. The following month, Francis II renounced the title of Holy Roman Emperor, a Habsburg family heirloom for the best part of 4 centuries. Meanwhile, Britain and Russia put out peace feelers to Napoleon. At this point, Prussia panicked at the possibility of losing Hanover to Britain in a peace settlement and started saber-rattling in Napoleon's direction, demanding the withdrawal of French troops from Germany. Napoleon reacted with disdain, dismissing as absurd the idea that, having kept out of the Third Coalition, Prussia would now take him on single-handed. But that is exactly what she proceeded to do. At the beginning of October 1806, the Prussian king Frederick William III advanced into Thuringia at the head of 150,000 men. It was a suicidal decision. Within a week, the Prussians had been routed by Napoleon at Jena and by Davout at Auerstedt, suffering massive casualties. By the end of the month, Napoleon was in Berlin. With its capital occupied, Prussia was on the ropes. But at this critical juncture, Russia came to Frederick William's aid, marching an army of 120,000 men into Prussian Poland and transforming the campaign into a genuine war of the Fourth Coalition. Napoleon immediately marched into Poland too. By the end of November, the Grand Army was in Warsaw, where Napoleon flattered Polish hopes of independence in return for an infusion of 30,000 Polish troops. On the 8th of February 1807, he met the combined Russian and Prussian forces at Eylau in East Prussia. Fought in atrocious winter conditions, with sub-zero blizzards reducing visibility to inches, the battle was the bloodiest engagement of the war to date, and resulted in the narrowest of French victories. Shaken, both sides regrouped before resuming the campaign in the summer, but it was Napoleon who turned the interval to best account. On the 14th of June, the 7th anniversary of Marengo, he inflicted a crushing defeat on the Russian forces at Friedland in East Prussia, and Tsar Alexander immediately sued for peace. On the 25th of June 1807, Napoleon and Alexander met on a specially built raft moored in the middle of the river Niemen at Tilsit on the Russian border. The two emperors discovered an intriguing mutual chemistry. "If Alexander were a woman, I would make him my mistress," Napoleon wrote to Josephine. Their discussions, spread over 2 weeks, resulted in a treaty that was more than just a peace agreement. It was a diplomatic revolution. Napoleon and Alexander, leaders of the two continental superpowers, effectively agreed to divide Europe between them. Russia recognized the creation of a Grand Duchy of Warsaw and a new Kingdom of Westphalia, with Napoleon's youngest brother Jerome as its king, while France recognized Russian ambitions in the Baltic and parts of Ottoman Europe. Prussia lost half her territory. Alexander further agreed to declare war on Britain and close his ports to British trade if Russian mediation failed to bring her to the peace table. The treaty marked the apogee of the Napoleonic Empire. Ominously for the future, though, it also boosted Napoleon's already inflated sense of invincibility. In the words of Fouché, his long-standing Minister of Police, after Tilsit, Napoleon believed himself the son of destiny, called to break every scepter. Similarly, Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister and one of the great survivors of the revolution, was so disturbed by the emperor's accelerating flight from moderation that he resigned the following month. Increasingly, Napoleon was surrounded only by yes-men. With the end of the Fourth Coalition, Britain once again faced France alone. But how was war to be waged, with the Royal Navy still supreme at sea and the Grand Army supreme on land? Napoleon had formalized his answer during the Prussian campaign. "I mean," he told his brother Louis, "to conquer the sea by the land." Accordingly, the Berlin Decree of November 1806 ordered an end to all trade with Britain in France and French-controlled territories, and the seizure of all British ships and their cargoes. Known as the Continental System, it was a policy of economic warfare, effectively a self-blockade designed to deprive Britain of her continental export markets and drain her economic lifeblood, while at the same time making Europe a captive market for French goods. In the long run, the Continental System and Britain's retaliatory measures would do untold damage to the continental as well as the British economy. In the short run, it made Napoleon a captive of his own policy. For it to work effectively, the system had to work everywhere. But not only was smuggling rife in French-occupied territories, there were also places in Europe where the full weight of Napoleon's writ did not yet run. Prime among them was Spain, at best a lukewarm ally, and Portugal, an ally of Britain, and it was to the Iberian Peninsula, fatefully, that the theatre of war now shifted. Napoleon's intervention in Spain, known to British historians as the Peninsular War, has often been seen as the turning point in his fortunes. Spain had effectively been occupied by French forces since the end of 1807, when Franco-Spanish troops invaded Portugal in an attempt to extend the continental system to the Portuguese coast. With unrest mounting in Madrid, Napoleon was now drawn into the dynastic infighting of the Spanish ruling house, the last Bourbons still to occupy a European throne. In June 1808, at a notorious conference in Bayonne, Napoleon browbeat them into abdication and replaced them with his brother Joseph, translating him from King of Naples to King of Spain for the purpose. Far from resolving the country's internal divisions, however, the move precipitated a massive popular uprising. Spanish resistance was soon buttressed by British troops, led from May 1809 by Sir Arthur Wellesley, later as the Duke of Wellington, Napoleon's nemesis at Waterloo. For 5 long years, the cream of Napoleon's marshals were bogged down in a war of attrition against British and Spanish forces, while the attacks of irregular Spanish fighters added the term guerrilla to the world's lexicon of conflict. By the time France finally withdrew from Spain after Wellington's victory at Victoria in June 1813, some 600,000 French soldiers had served in a campaign the savagery of which has been captured for posterity by Goya's nightmarish engravings, The Disasters of War. Napoleon himself put in only the briefest of appearances as a military commander in Spain at the end of 1808. In the new year, he returned to France to prepare for the imminent mobilization of Austria, who seized the opportunity of his Iberian entanglement to declare war on the 9th of April. Since Austerlitz, Austrian armies had been reorganized along French lines, and they were soon making headway in Italy, Germany, and Poland. Napoleon mustered his forces and counterattacked in Germany, defeating the Archduke Charles at Eckmühl on the 22nd of April and occupying Vienna 3 weeks later. But on the 21st and 22nd of May, in a 2-day battle centered on the villages of Aspern and Essling, Napoleon suffered a major blow to his reputation, if not to his self-esteem, his first ever defeat on the battlefield. Despite the loss of some 20,000 men, he quickly recovered, reorganized, and reinforced. On the 5th of July, the French and Austrian armies clashed again near the village of Wagram, not far from Vienna. Wagram was the greatest artillery battle the world had seen, and involved the largest forces of any battle of the Napoleonic Wars so far. Casualties on both sides were appalling. Perhaps 1 in 4 of all the soldiers in the field, including no fewer than 40 French generals. But over the course of 2 days' fighting, Napoleon succeeded in forcing the Austrians back, and within a week the Emperor Francis sued for peace. The War of the Fifth Coalition, as it's sometimes known, had lasted less than 3 months. Under the terms of the Treaty of Schönbrunn, signed on the 14th of October, Austria lost some 3.5 million subjects, was subjected to crippling indemnities, and was forced to join the continental system. She would soon be bound still more tightly to France's interests. Napoleon was a hereditary emperor with no legitimate son and no prospect of one so long as he remained married to Josephine. As a result, he had finally persuaded himself to divorce her at the end of 1809, and in March 1810, 5 months after the Treaty of Schönbrunn, he married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor and great-niece of Louis XVI's ill-fated queen, Marie Antoinette. A son was born a year later. Baptized Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles, he was known from birth as the King of Rome, and would be briefly proclaimed Napoleon II on his father's abdication in 1815. The years after Wagram saw the Spanish conflict drag on, consuming France's men, money and prestige, and feeding a growing mood of war weariness at home. They also witnessed a profound economic crisis, a Europe-wide depression exacerbated by Napoleon's attempts to extend the continental system. Most dramatically of all, the period confirmed the breakdown of Napoleon's relationships with 2 key players on the international stage, Pope Pius VII and Tsar Alexander I. The roots of both breakdowns preceded the War of the Fifth Coalition. Relations with the Pope had already been strained by the way the Concordat was enacted into French law, giving Napoleon powers over the Church, which Pius VII had never foreseen. An equivalent dispute between temporal and spiritual authority bedeviled relations with the papacy at the international level. Napoleon claimed that the Pope, as a temporal Italian prince, was subject to his authority as emperor, and insisted that the Papal States join the continental system. Pius refused, and in February 1808, French troops occupied Rome. In May the following year, Napoleon annexed outright what he hadn't already taken of the Papal States, prompting Pius to excommunicate everyone involved. The following month, French troops seized Pius himself and interned him at Savona on the Ligurian coast, where he would remain under house arrest until January 1812, when he was moved to Fontainebleau. The dispute rumbled on until 1814, when Pius was finally allowed back to Rome, having held out against Napoleon's threats and blandishments with a forgiving dignity that was widely admired. The confrontation with Pius VII did lasting damage to Napoleon's reputation in Catholic Europe, but it was as nothing to the shattering consequences of his confrontation with Alexander I. Here, too, the origins of the trouble preceded Wagram. By the time the 2 emperors met in opulent conference at Erfurt in September 1808, the amity of Tilsit had already begun to sour. French intentions in the Grand Duchy of Warsaw were a particular source of concern for Alexander, as was Napoleon's slowness to withdraw his troops from Prussia. For his part, Napoleon had taken offence when Alexander rejected his proposal of marriage to one of the Tsar's sisters, a snub from which his union with Marie-Louise was an instant dynastic rebound. Equally toxic was the question of the continental system. Alexander had enforced it throughout his territories at devastating cost to the Russian economy, but Napoleon's France First policy in economic, as in all other areas, gave the Tsar precious little in return. Matters came to a head at the end of 1810, when Napoleon annexed the Grand Duchy of Oldenburg in contravention of the Treaty of Tilsit. Alexander responded by opening his ports to neutral shipping and slapping a stiff tariff on French goods imported into Russia. Throughout 1811, both emperors made increasingly strained protestations of friendship while preparing for the war each expected the other to declare. By the summer of 1812, the stage was set for one of the greatest catastrophes in military history. The Grand Army that gathered along the Russian frontier in June that year was the largest the world had ever seen. Levies in France and the French-controlled territories had raised a multinational force of more than 600,000 men, only about a third of whom were actually French. Napoleon's campaign plan was much as it had always been, to force his opponents to join battle, defeat them in detail, occupy key cities, and impose a favourable peace. But Alexander had on his side the unforgiving climate of Russia and the sheer vastness of her distances. The Grand Army's frontline troops began to cross the river Niemen on the 24th of June, only to find as they advanced that the Russian army repeatedly melted away in front of them, drawing them deeper and deeper into the country. By the time he reached Vilna, after a week's march in alternating torrential rain and searing heat, Napoleon had already lost some 25,000 men and 20,000 horses. He remained at Vilna for more than 2 weeks before pressing on to Vitebsk, 200 miles further east, but here too the Russian army eluded him. 2 months into the campaign, and the situation was becoming desperate. Napoleon had still not fought a decisive battle. After weeks of forced marches through desolate countryside, hunger and sickness had taken a terrible toll on his men, and many of his most experienced generals were urging him to call a halt. But on the 25th of August, the Emperor resumed his advance towards Moscow, another 200 miles to the east, and it was on the 7th of September, at the village of Borodino, some 70 miles west of the city, that Napoleon finally met the full force of the Russian army, now led by his old Austerlitz adversary, General Kutuzov. Napoleon would describe Borodino as the most terrible of all my battles. For hour after hour, the Russians withstood everything Napoleon could throw against them, though for some reason he held back the elite Imperial Guard, which might have struck the coup de grâce. When Kutuzov finally withdrew, the French had sustained some 30,000 casualties, the Russians some 50,000, nearly a third of the total number of combatants. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow unopposed, expecting peace envoys to arrive from Alexander at any moment. But the city was eerily deserted. The explanation was not long in coming. That night, teams of Russian arsonists laid fires throughout Moscow, triggering an inferno that burned for 5 days and destroyed 4/5 of the city's buildings. Rather than make peace with the invader, Russia had chosen to sacrifice her holiest city. Brushing aside warnings about the coming snows, Napoleon lingered in the Kremlin for another month. But even he knew the game was up. On the 19th of October, 1812, the great retreat from Moscow began. The story of that retreat is one of epic horror. For 2 months, the battered remains of the Grand Army struggled across the 500 miles from Moscow to the Niemen, harassed every step of the way by Russian troops, Cossacks and peasants. Their supply stations had been captured or plundered, and at the end of November the survivors found themselves cut off by the icy waters of the Berezina, where the Russians had destroyed the only bridge on the French line of retreat. Pontoons were improvised under heavy fire, enabling some 50,000 men to get across, but thousands more perished on the banks behind them. Even then, the worst was yet to come. In the first days of December, temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees. Napoleon himself left by sleigh for Paris on the 5th of December, but the sorry remainder of the Grand Army were exposed to the full rigour of the Russian winter. 9 days later, when Marshal Ney shepherded the last of the rearguard back across the Niemen, just 20,000 men remained from the formidable fighting force that had crossed it in the opposite direction 6 months earlier. The campaign had claimed some 500,000 of Napoleon's men. After Moscow, Napoleon would later say, fortune ceased to smile on me. Certainly, events now started to move very fast. From the moment he arrived in Paris on the 18th of December, Napoleon began to recrank his military machine, ordering a vast mass levy of conscripts. On the 12th of January, 1813, Russian forces crossed the Niemen into Prussia and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. The following month, Prussia allied herself with Russia, and on the 16th of March declared war on France. Napoleon knew it was only a matter of time before he found himself facing a sixth coalition potentially more powerful than any of those which had gone before. By the end of April, he had mobilized more than 150,000 men in Germany. On the 2nd of May, he threw back a Russo-Prussian army at Lützen, but the victory was costly in French lives and made less decisive by the lack of French cavalry, still suffering from the loss of tens of thousands of horses in the Russian campaign. Later the same month, French and Allied forces clashed again at Bautzen, and again Napoleon was denied a conclusive victory by his lack of cavalry. A few days later, both sides agreed an armistice, which was signed at Pleswitz on the 4th of June. It would last until the 13th of August. These weeks of ceasefire were a period of intense diplomatic activity. The prime mover was one of the subtlest statesmen of the 19th century, Clemens von Metternich, formerly Austrian ambassador to Paris and now Austria's foreign minister. Metternich had promoted Napoleon's Habsburg marriage and had for many months been seeking to bring him to the peace table on terms that would maintain a balance of power in Europe between France and Russia. At the convention of Reichenbach in June, the Allies agreed on an ultimatum. Napoleon must accept the independence of the Confederation of the Rhine, the dissolution of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, the return of the Illyrian provinces to Austria, and the restoration of Prussia's 1805 frontiers. If he did not, Austria would join the coalition against him. Metternich presented these terms to Napoleon in a famous 9-hour meeting at the Marcolini Palace in Dresden on the 26th of June. "Peace and war lie in your Majesty's hands," he told the Emperor. "Today you can yet conclude peace. Tomorrow it may be too late." Napoleon responded with a violent tirade. Unlike monarchs born to their thrones, he railed, "My reign will not outlast the day when I have ceased to be strong, and therefore to be feared." "Sire," replied Metternich, "you are lost." On the 12th of August, 1813, Austria entered the war. When hostilities resumed, the Grand Army had astonishingly regained a paper strength of more than 300,000, but the coalition now included Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Britain, Spain, and Portugal, with combined forces of over 500,000 men. What's more, the Allied armies cannily did what they could to avoid engagement with Napoleon himself, whose presence on the battlefield, Wellington famously observed, was worth 40,000 men. It was a sound strategy. While Napoleon's generals lost a string of engagements with Allied forces, at the end of August, Napoleon inflicted defeat on the Austro-Russian army of Bohemia in the 2-day Battle of Dresden. It was his last major victory. On the 16th of October, at Leipzig, he faced an Allied army of more than 250,000 men, and his own forces, heavily outnumbered even before the Allies brought up huge reinforcements, were defeated in 3 days of the bloodiest fighting of the Napoleonic Wars. By the end of what became known as the Battle of the Nations, 70,000 French and perhaps some 60,000 Allied soldiers had been lost, and France's eastern frontier lay open to the Allies. The following month Wellington's forces, fresh from their victory at Vittoria in June, crossed into France from Spain. Napoleon's grand empire was unravelling by the day, and for the first time since 1792, the French army found itself fighting to defend French soil. Even in this crisis, with public opinion palpably restless under the costs of continuing war, the Emperor still believed he could turn the tables. Declining peace on any of the terms offered by the Allies, he launched a last-ditch campaign of legendary speed and audacity. Against all the odds, it produced a handful of local victories, but each proved only a temporary check to the inexorable Allied advance. By the end of March, the coalition forces were in Paris. Marshal Marmont formally surrendered the city early on the 31st, and Alexander and Frederick William entered the capital in triumph a few hours later. The following day they announced that they would no longer treat with Napoleon, now ensconced at Fontainebleau with some 60,000 men. Talleyrand formed a provisional government, and on the 2nd of April the Senate declared the Emperor deposed, and invited the Comte de Provence, the oldest surviving brother of Louis XVI, to take the throne as King Louis XVIII. Napoleon's instinct, as ever, was to fight on, but his commanders would no longer support him. On the 4th of April, Marmont, a comrade in arms since Toulon, took his troops over to the Allied side. 2 days later, Napoleon abdicated. On the 20th of April, the former emperor bade a moving farewell to his imperial guard in the courtyard at Fontainebleau. On the 28th, he sailed for the Mediterranean island of Elba, over which the Allies had granted him full sovereignty. A petty kingdom for a man whose ambitions had embraced the whole of Europe. Here the story of Napoleonic France might have ended, but the most remarkable chapter was yet to be written. In March 1815, representatives at the Congress of Vienna, where the Allies had been meeting for the last 6 months to hammer out a European settlement, were electrified by the arrival of unexpected news. Napoleon had left Elba and had landed in the south of France. He had with him a guard of some 750 men. It was 11 months since Napoleon had last set foot in the country. In the interval, Louis XVIII's hidebound insensitivity to the social climate of post-revolutionary France had sown the seeds of widespread discontent. As Napoleon marched towards Paris, he found himself reaping the harvest. He was cheered by the peasantry in village after village. Army units sent to arrest him came over to his side, most dramatically in Grenoble, where he confronted an infantry regiment alone and on foot, opening his famous greatcoat with the words, "Kill your emperor if you wish." Even Marshal Ney, who had promised to bring his former commander to Paris in an iron cage, rallied to Napoleon's cause when he saw which way the wind was blowing. Louis XVIII could see it too, and on the 19th of March, he slipped out of the capital. The following day, Napoleon was carried into the Tuileries Palace on the shoulders of an exultant crowd. Thus began the period known as the 100 Days, a surreal 3-month postscript to Napoleon's decade-long reign as Emperor of the French. In an 11th-hour access of constitutionalism, Napoleon sought to redefine himself as a liberal emperor in contrast to the autocrat of old. But if conciliation rallied support at home, it cut no ice with the Allies. In March, their representatives in Vienna proclaimed Napoleon an outlaw. Some 220,000 Allied troops were already stationed along the Belgian border in separate contingents under Wellington and Blücher, the Prussian commander at Leipzig, and more could be deployed within weeks. Napoleon knew that his best hope lay in swift and decisive victory. On the 15th of June, he crossed the border into Belgium with a front-line force of 120,000 men, aiming to drive a wedge between Blücher's and Wellington's armies. On the 16th, He routed Blücher's Prussians at Ligny, while 6 miles to the west, Ney fought an inconclusive action against Wellington at Quatre Bras. The following day, Wellington withdrew his forces to a defensible ridge on the Charleroi road some 10 miles south of Brussels, setting up his headquarters in a little village a mile to the north. Its name was Waterloo. On the morning of the 18th of June, 1815, Napoleon's and Wellington's armies faced one another for what would prove the decisive engagement of the 100 Days. Napoleon hoped Ligny would have left Blücher too weak to join up with Wellington's forces. But not until the afternoon did Ney launch the first assault on Wellington's positions, by which time the Prussian columns could already be seen approaching in the distance. For more than 7 hours, the British held out against infantry and cavalry charges alike. Finally, even the elite Old Guard fell back before the firepower of the British squares. By now, the Prussians had arrived on the scene, and Wellington began to advance, driving the shattered French forces before him. By the end of the day, Napoleon had lost some 40,000 men, the Allies more than 20,000. It had been, as Wellington remarked, a damn close-run thing. But after 23 years of almost continuous conflict, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars were finally drawing to a close. From then on, it was a replay of spring 1814. 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. A new provisional government was formed, this time under Fouché, his former Minister of Police. On the 3rd of July, Paris capitulated to the Allies, and 5 days later, Louis XVIII returned to the capital. But there was no Elba for Napoleon this time. Instead, he was exiled to the tiny British-administered island of St. Helena, in the South Atlantic. Here, 1,000 miles from the nearest mainland, he spent the remaining 5.5 years of his life, gardening, feuding with the British governor, and refurbishing his record for posterity in the company of a handful of squabbling courtiers. He died, aged 51, on the 5th of May, 1821, probably, despite a rich vein of conspiracy theories, of stomach cancer. In 1840, his body was ceremonially reinterred at the Invalides in Paris, where it lies to this day. Nearly 2 centuries after his death, debate still rages around Napoleon's life and legacy as fiercely as it did around the man himself. Was he a liberator or an oppressor, a champion of enlightenment or a military dictator, the preserver of the French Revolution or its destroyer? And what sort of man could encompass so many contradictions? Uniquely among modern leaders, Napoleon invites comparison with the great warrior-statesman of antiquity. But he is too big a presence to be contained by the battlefield and the tribune, just as he was too big to be contained by the geopolitics of his time. His universality seems rather to evoke the world of creative genius. For all the millions of words devoted to him, Napoleon remains at core impervious to classification, a phenomenon, in the words of one fellow Corsican and lifelong enemy, the likes of whom we shall not see again, a moral and political universe unto himself. A nation, Napoleon once said, is always what you know how to make it. And it is perhaps above all as an essay in possibility that his extraordinary life and career should be read. As one of his counselors remarked, Napoleon never discovered the point at which the impossible begins. As such, he remains both inspiration and warning, a symbol of human potential for good and ill, the man on horseback forever pointing towards the outer limits of our capacity for change.